Hi, today I'm going to be talking about functions in Scratch, or as they're called, custom blocks. So, first of all, let's look at my blocks. What we can do in Scratch is make a block. Now, we'll do that in just a second, but let's start by defining what we want to do. So, maybe we want to make a square. So let's say, or move in a square is what I mean. So let's say we want our cat to move 100 steps, and then, well, we turn 90 degrees to make a square. And if we do that, right, it's going to do a quarter of the square. And then we can do it again and again and again to make the square. So what we can do is go to Control and use loops, specifically a repeat X number of times loop. So in this case, we repeat 4 times, you move 100 steps, and you turn 90 degrees. And when you run that whole thing, it makes a square. And if we add a little delay, you can see it better. Perfect. So we've made a square. Now, what if we want to make a bigger square? Well, we can increase the number of steps per side, right? So now it's going to make a much bigger square, and then a smaller square. We decrease the number of steps per side, and notice that this move 50 steps, which I just decreased, is within this repeat. So this is each side out of the 4 is decreasing in its number of steps. And when we run this whole thing, it's a tiny square. So now, what if we wanted to make a block that could do this for us without having to write all this code? And blocks become even more useful when you have a ton of stuff. But in this case, it's still hard to write 4 blocks every time we want to make a square, for instance. So what we can do is go to My Blocks, click Make a Block, and then write in the name of the block. So we'll call it Square 100 Steps. And 100 steps because we're going to make this a square with side length 100 steps. We're going to press OK, and then there's going to be a define block that appears. And what we can do is if we drag this under the define block, suddenly this square 100 steps block will represent these 4 blocks. So if you imagine every time we see this pink square 100 steps block, or sorry, we have to change it so it's actually 100 steps. But the point is, every time you see this pink square 100 steps block, right, these 4 blocks, the repeat 4, move 100 steps, turn 90 degrees, wait 0.5 seconds, and it'll make a square, will run. So when we click this, it'll create a square. And notice that when we click this block on the left is running. And that's because this references the blocks that this function is defined by. And what we can do is we can repeat this function twice, for example, and then it'll make 2 squares in a row because it's running this function, we call it, twice. In other words, it's running the code that it's defined by right here twice. So just to go over this one more time, when I click this square 100 steps function, it looks at how square 100 steps is defined, and it follows those instructions. Specifically, it repeats 4 times, moving forward and turning. And that just creates a square. All right, so the next thing we can talk about is what if we want to have a function that can make a square of any size? And for that, we'll need to use what's called parameters. So let's put this to the side for a second, and let's make a new block. We'll just call it square. And now what we're going to do is click Add an Input, and we want it to be a number or text. And this number of text we'll call side length. And when we press OK, it'll create a new define block. So remember, what is the define block? It's where you put the code that you want to run every time that you run this square block. So remember, this is the square block. Every time we run this, every time this square block on the right gets run, everything under the define block will get run. And we can basically represent what's under the define block by this little tiny block right here. So now let's duplicate this and put it in. But now we want to basically make a square of a variable side length, some side length that we insert when we want to make a square. And so what we're going to do is use this parameter, we call it side length, here. So in other words, when we run the square with a side length 100 and we plug in 100 for this variable side length, we're treating side length as a variable. It's called a parameter because it's inside a function. And when we plug in 100 for the side length, it'll move 100 steps every time, and therefore the square will be 100 side length. And if we plugged in 200, it'll be a bigger square, for example. So in other words, if we write square 100, and notice this 100 is in the place of that side length in the definition, so 100 will get plugged in for side length, which will get plugged in for the move steps, as we can see here, and therefore it'll create a square of side length 100. And when we run it, it does indeed. And then we can increase this, and it does indeed make a bigger square. So that's the essence of a function, that you can basically run a block of code in just a tiny amount of space here, square 200, and you can represent this enormous block of code here by just one block, and that makes it easier to represent your code and understand your code. And just some key terms here. Part of a function might be a parameter, which is basically a variable that you pass into the function, that you give to the function, and the function takes that variable and basically uses it to perform its duties. So in this case, it uses the side length that you pass in so you pass in 200 as the argument, that's the vocabulary term, and you pass that to the parameter side length, parameter is the vocabulary term there, and side length acts as a variable within that function to tell you how many steps you should move 4 times. So when we click this square block, the 200 gets passed in. The cat knows to run this define block. The define block uses this 200 to move 200 steps, turn 90 degrees, wait 0.5 seconds 4 times. That creates a square of length, side length. And suddenly, the cat can draw whatever size square it wants just using this tiny block. All right, that's it. Thank you.